Thank you. Thanks for coming, and stop me if you have any questions. So I'm just going to read some selected passages, I guess. And the first one is from the foreword. I wrote this for my kids, kind of an Irish memoir, if that's a thing. It provides advice and example of what to and not to do by way of 99% accurate storytelling. I graduated from Michigan State University in 1980 with a degree in biochemistry and went lobstering just for the summer. And it wasn't long before I found myself 200 miles offshore doing the whole captain's courageous thing. My biochem degree and the prospect of working for government, academia, or a pharmaceutical company, what was I thinking, washed overboard with the outgoing tide. I needed to get lost for a summer. Putting aside books and job interviews, I took a job working in the prettiest environment most people will never see. Just for the summer turned into the winter. The following summer, another 5 years working on offshore trawlers, including one of New England's highlighters fishing on George's Bank out of Boston Harbor. My full-time gig on the water ended. I spent another 35 years at fish auctions, fish and shellfish farms, fishery management meetings, processing plants, wharves, waterfronts from Stonington, Maine to Point Judith, Rhode Island, not to mention a lot of restaurant kitchens across half the country. I never had a concrete plan, preferring life that offered a closer connection to nature and the freedom to live outside the 9-to-5 world and pay scales that more closely matched my effort and success. True, in my chosen world, 12 hours is only half a day, followed by the phrase, "you lazy bastard." But long hours, hard work, and the exercise of a sharp mind needed to succeed here leaves you with a satisfaction found by folks who love what they do. So enough of that. So the first chapter is about lobstering, and I'm going to read a little passage called Back to the Shipyard. So I've been working on the Lorna Lorry for about a little over a year, and it's a 30-foot Jonesport boat out of Booth Bay Harbor. And I worked for a guy named Pop Durfee, and I had spent the summer with him, and I had a really hard winter. I was working in a shipyard because we were only hauling once a week, and we were further and further offshore in that little boat, and weren't getting much. I wasn't supporting myself lobstering, so I was working in Luke's shipyard building aluminum. He built aluminum sailboats, and shipyards are not fun places. You guys know that better than anybody. So back to the shipyard. The weather warmed, and we began hauling more often. Spring can be very unpredictable and unforgiving if you're not watching the weather, but the lobsters, springers, as Pop called them, were terrific. They were full of meat, had really hard shells, and the little horns along the edges of the shell were white as snow. We began moving our gear closer and closer to shore, making ready to set traps that we built all winter. We built wooden traps back in the day, so this was, I'm dating myself, the wire pots were just starting to show up. We replaced some of the older ones and added new ones to the total number we would fish. Late spring, Pop announced it was time to go back into the shipyard, and we brought the boat in the shipyard every year. And this is, you can see the picture of the Lorna Lorry. That's several months removed from the shipyard. Boats get pretty beaten up, especially wooden ones. Lorna Lorry got hauled out. We found ourselves along a half a dozen other lobster boats doing the same. One belonged to a fisherman named Sheldon Burnham, a wiry man with a mischievous smile and a big mouth, who also worked at Luke's shipyard with me in the winter. So my job at Luke's was assistant electrician. I followed the electrician, a guy named DJ, or Dog Jaws, as we crawled through the hull, running wire for 2 60-foot ocean yachts being built there. As assistant electrician, I basically did whatever DJ told me to do, which mostly consisted of hanging upside down with a hole saw, cutting out wireways through the ribs. One day I just started cutting a hole when the lunch horn sounded. Shipyards are notoriously loud, dirty, smoke-filled, and dusty places from all the burning, welding, sanding, drilling that goes on. But the yard came dead silent once the horn sounded, with all the machinery and power tools shut down. Silent except for my drill turning the hole saw as I was set on finishing that last hole before eating. The hole was in a more awkward spot than usual, and the saw began to bind up, causing the drill to whine loudly. The drill bit finally gave up and snapped, leaving the hole saw stuck in the hole. The heavy drill set free swung down against the hull with a loud thump. Frustrated, I picked up the drill, unplugged it, walked up onto the deck, and made my way across the gangplank. We were in a big barn-like building for lunch, and that's when I heard a voice from below. "Ying, ying, ying, gunk." And I looked down and saw Sheldon, who was part of the hull crew that repeatedly applied and sanded something called microballoons, a Bondo-like substance, to the hull. These were aluminum yachts, so if you didn't cover the hull, electrolysis would basically sink the boat. And I looked down, and Sheldon, who was part of the hull crew, so Sheldon had a big smile on his face, and he repeated himself, mimicking the sound of my failed attempt. Ying, 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 gunk. Fuck off, Sheldon. That's a good nickname for you, Ying Ying Gunk. My apologies to any kids that are listening on Zoom. And I repeated myself. I already have a nickname, it's Bill. This kind of exchange became the sole and ongoing basis for our interactions until we ended our time at Luke's to get back to lobstering. But when we hauled the Lorna Lorry out in the spring to caulk and repaint, A-Hole had his boat hauled out at the same shipyard and was working right alongside Pop and I. The whole nickname thing started up again. He was determined to brand me with it. I was pissed. Sometimes relief comes to those who suffer, even when it's minor suffering caused by mouthy pricks. Sheldon had a beautiful daughter around 16 years old who brought him lunch every afternoon. Body language says a lot. She loved her dad, and he was intensely proud of her. After lunch, it wasn't long before Sheldon came at me with the nicknaming shit. I had enough. Ying, 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 gunk, he said, cackling at me after what must have been an invigorating lunch. Sheldon, this is going to stop, understand? I said, looking at him squarely in the eye, mustering my most menacing glare. Call me, he said, I ain't scared of you. You can't stop me, Mr. Ying Ying Gunk. Call me that one more time, you'll regret it. Ha! Nothing you can do about it. What are you going to do? Call me that one more time, I let the sentence hang in the air, and I'll marry your daughter. All the color drained from Sheldon's face. A shocked and worried look took over and his jaw dropped to his chest. He sputtered and turned on his heel and stalked away. And this is true, Sheldon didn't say another word to me for years. He wouldn't even look at me. Years later, while I was working on a trawler, I had the chance to chat with him. He insisted he wasn't afraid of me marrying his daughter, but I saw his face. It's a pity cell phones weren't around back then. We'll skip over this one. And so I left the Lorna Lorry and got a job on a boat called the Calvin L. Stinson, fishing out of Rockland here. It was a trawler that was built by Calvin's. These are some of the Booth Bay lobstermen. I could name them all if you were interested. But this was back in the, I want to say, the early 80s. You know, Billy Rogers, Douglas Carter, et cetera. So the Calvin Stinson is the boat down on the bottom there, and it was a boat made to do everything. So it could bottom trawl, it could midwater trawl, and it had a purse seine on board. So it was a boat that could do everything. And the title of this chapter is called The Jack of All Boats, but it couldn't do any of them well. So, you know, I went looking for a site, and the Calvin was looking for crew, and I didn't understand back then if a boat was looking for crew, it's probably because it wasn't a very good boat to work on. Even though it was brand new, you know, they spent a ridiculous amount of money on it. We had the sort of like the company store mentality at Stinson Canning. So a couple of little tidbits from there. FNG. As the FNG, or new guy, I was immediately designated hole man. That meant I stayed behind working in the fish hold to pack and ice the fish after everyone had finished dressing the fish and went back to their bunks. Tink, one of the guys on board, gave me a perfunctory orientation and left me to it. On the fourth night of my first trip, I was in the upper level of the port tank. So this boat had 6 big tanks. Most boats have a fish hold, draggers. This one was built for herring, so it had a shaft alley down the middle and these 6 giant tanks that could fill with water and herring, but some were converted over to hold ice and fish. But they were really tall. They were 2 stories tall inside this boat. It was a huge boat. So I was in the upper level of the port tank chopping ice. The seas were up. We had a pretty good roll on, testing my balance as I chopped away and shoveled. The deck plate above my head, and so they put these little manhole covers in where they could pour the herring down in, and then they'd seal them, but they didn't seal good. So every time we rolled, I got a shower of water on the back of my neck. The deck plate was above my head and leaking with each roll, blessing the back of my neck with a shower of cold salt water. I could hear the water wash across the deck as we rolled, and then a short burst would rain down. I began to time my movements and back away from underneath the deck plate each time I heard the water washing along the deck to avoid the shower. This move saved my life. I heard the water wash, I backed away waiting for the shower, the boat rolled, and then without warning, with a loud whoosh, a flash of white passed across my face, and it was a minivan-sized chunk of ice. The ice had solidified into a solid mass, and it slid right through the spot I was standing in and slammed into the bulkhead. It would have crushed me to a pulp. Once my breathing and heart rate returned to normal, I finished icing down the fish with a silent thank you and went up to the crew quarters. Everything seemed normal and quiet. Tink was sitting in the galley reading a book and having a coffee with Reggie. Sandy was in the wheelhouse standing the towing watch, and the skipper was in the bunk, as usual. I said nothing and went to my bunk. As I got more into fish handling and quality, I wondered about putting the FNG in charge of packing and icing the fish. The process determined how the fish looked, a prime factor in the price. And why put somebody who doesn't know what they're doing that? But that's the way the thing went. But that was kind of fishing. You have these quiet, boring moments, and all of a sudden something really like shocking happens. And if sometimes it happens to everybody, sometimes it just happens to you, and then you go back to this sort of normal grind. So things got bad on that boat because couldn't do anything well. We weren't making any money. So this little vignette's called the Bugs Bunny Memo. As morale dropped and the relations with the crew and ownership deteriorated, there were some outright and subtle changes. Outright, Tink got fired. Tink had a lot to say about management, so they got rid of him. And when management got tired of his attitude, however justified, while his son Danny stayed aboard. A less bold change came in the form of a bulletin board installed in the galley for memos from corporate that to us seemed not only condescending but rude. Captain Shannon caught in the middle, and Shannon was kind of like out of his depth as a captain. He was actually the de facto captain. The real captain was a guy from Scotland who had a green card, so he couldn't really be the captain, so he was the fishing master, but he ran the boat. He was a pretty good guy, but Shannon was in charge, so he had the final say. So Captain Shannon, caught in the middle, not well thought of by management and referred to as asshole by us, became distant and began using the board more often as a communication tool. Skippers scream from the pilot house window, rave over the deck hailer, rage at the crew in the galley, or holler down the stairs from the wheelhouse. Occasionally, they'll even drop a crewman with one punch, admonishing the rest of the crew to leave him there. But issuing demands via bulletin board had to be a first. The absurdity of this was not lost on my brother and I, so we joined the party. We filled the bulletin board with memos chastising ourselves for all sorts of ridiculous reasons. Personal hygiene, lack of or too much, Maine accent, nose picking, ugly girlfriends, ugly boyfriends, but the pinnacle was the Bugs Bunny memo. I took over as cook after Tink got canned. It was my job to grub up. One of the crew requests was vitamins. Amused, I chose a bottle of Looney Tunes chewables. The crew loved them. The Bugs Bunny memo went as followed. It has come to the attention of management that crew members are picking out Bugs Bunny vitamins and leaving Elmer Fudd, Daffy Duck, Foghorn Leghorn, Sylvester Granny, and Tweety behind. When choosing vitamins, henceforward the crew will be indiscriminate so others will have a chance to eat Bugs Bunny too. Regards, Stinson Canning. The bulletin board disappeared the next day. Shortly after that, Shannon Gilbert was fired and Sandy was elevated to skipper. The company decided to use Reggie, who was the engineer, as de facto captain, but left no doubt that we, Reggie included, answered to Sandy. My brother and I were sitting in the galley when Sandy came down from corporate and gave us the news. Tim and I looked at each other silently, looked then back at Sandy and said in unison, "Now we're going to call you asshole." I left the old colony and went on a boat call. I left the Calvin Stinson and got a site. I kept hearing about this boat in Boston called the Old Colony, which was a Highliner. They caught a lot of fish. They were making ridiculous money. And so I started showing up in Boston when I knew the boat was coming in. And my second try, the captain had just fired a guy, so he took me on as cook. I said, yeah, I can cook, because I had been cooking on the Calvin Stinson. So it's that boat in the middle there. It was another 135-foot steel dragger. Was built to like American shipping standards by the Fulham Company. It talks a little bit about the Fulhams in here. And it was a really great seaboat. The deck wasn't set up that well. It was hard to work, but it was still was a great boat. And Franny St. Croix was, I still keep in touch with him. He fished in Alaska for a while. He was maybe 2 years older than me, but he might have been like 20 years older than me. He was that good at that. You know, he was trained by a master fisherman, his father, and he was a screamer. But that was sort of a way of keeping us present, because if you lose focus, if you daydream, that's when people get hurt. So it was all about being present and staying out of trouble. So it talks about that, but I got one little vignette, and it's called Malaka. Anybody speak Greek? It means asshole. One of the guys on the Old Colony gang was a Greek immigrant called Christos, or Chris the Greek, in Boston Fish Pier parlance. Chris was average height, broad shoulders, long muscled arms, and huge hands. He spoke with a thick accent and generally had a smile on his face and a twinkle in his eyes. Chris is often referred to me as Malaka, Greek for asshole, which I likely deserved. He also had a gambling problem. We'd come ashore, take out fish, settle up on an average trip, receive about $3,300. This is $1982, and I did a little Google search. That's equivalent of a little over $10,000 in 2024. The issue for Chris was he'd pass both the dog and the horse track on the way home, so he'd often double or triple his money before losing it all and then going home. Whenever Chris spoke of gambling, the light in his eyes disappeared and it was replaced by a look of hunger and obsession. The one trip I was ever allowed to take off from the Old Colony, I spent my time in New York City, Long Island, and New Jersey. Don't ask me why Jersey. And happened to visit the Meadowlands horse track. It occurred to me a lot of the guys I encountered around the betting windows had the exact same look in their eyes. Chris showed up often showed up at the boat the day we sailed and had to borrow money for cigarettes. He always seemed to have enough for a bag of weed, though. I can still see Chris disappearing behind the doghouse near the stern as we hauled back and watched the smoke emanate from behind the structure. Shortly after, Chris would reappear with lidded eyes and a sappy smile that told everyone he just got baked. His good nature would return for a few hours until the buzz wore off, and then he'd get grumpy again. To me, his mood swings became tiresome. It all came to a head while we were below deck in the process room dressing fish. I was slated to head up to the galley to begin the 7:30 p.m. meal, so it was about 6:30, and I had an hour to cook. I put my ripper in the slot, took my dressing gloves off, laid them on the rail, and noticed a small, undersized flatfish at the floor near my feet. Chris was behind me to my right, cleaning up fish that had fallen on the floor below the trash conveyor with a pitchfork. I tossed the fish at the trash conveyor, but it missed and landed at Chris's feet, and he snapped. His face configured in an angry mash, and he shouted at me, "Malaka, you do that on purpose, Malakia." "Oh, I didn't." "You do it, Malaka," he shouted. It was 4 hours after haul back and Chris's sojourn behind the doghouse for another joint, which had worn off right on grumpy time schedule. "Chris, if you can't leave the weed on shore, stay there with it," I growled. "What you say?" he said menacingly, advancing toward me while leveling the pitchfork tines at my chest. Being young and stupid, I took a step towards him so that tines were inches from my chest, looked him right in the eyes, and said slowly and clearly, "If you can't leave the weed ashore, stay there with it." I let the words hang in the air, still locking eyes with him, turned on my heel and went up to make dinner. Chris came up to me after dinner and said, "Billy, we still gonna be friends. Never talk to me again." We had little to say to each other after that. Years later, I met up with a friend, Jerry Keogh, a shipmate and lifelong friend, who asked, "Hey, did you hear about Chris the Greek? He's in jail in Alaska." It turns out Chris's wife finally had enough of the gambling and dumped him. She left for Alaska with another man. Chris wasn't about to let that happen. He followed him out with a stop in Reno, Nevada, where he reportedly hit it big. He left Reno $400,000 richer. Actually had a duffel bag full of cash with him. Sometimes God tells us to let things go and move on, but Chris wasn't listening. He continued his journey to the town where his ex and her new beau were living, which I believe was Kodiak, and checked into a local hotel and then bought a gun. He caught up with the two of them in the bar, pulled out the gun, and started shooting. He missed his targets, but the story goes he hit 5 other people, killing 2 of them. Jerry said Chris was now living in an Alaska prison. At that point in the story, I visibly shuddered because I could literally feel the tines of the pitchfork sticking into my back. So I left the Old Colony after 2 years, and I ended up on a boat called the Irene's Way. We fished out of Booth Bay. And this was a special boat. It was, unlike the other two, it was only about 80 feet. but a stainless steel fish hold that had a refrigerator in the fish hold, a captain who was a real wizard with fishing gear and gear design, so it got me into a whole new level of thinking about fishing. But he also was open to my sort of harebrained ideas of quality at sea. So I got him to buy boxes. We were boxing fish at sea. We were doing all this stuff, and it was a good 2 years. We were getting, it's how I met Foley Fish, my employer for 35 years after that. Was they were buying that product at a premium when other companies wouldn't. And so Richard was a great guy as a gear technician, as a fisherman. He was really fishy. He could see the bottom in his mind. He could hunt the fish, but his life was a mess. His finances were a mess. His marriage was a mess. There were about 5 kids, and I think 3 of them were actually his. All were born while he was married to the same woman. But so he started to lose it a little bit. The title of this section is called, and my apologies, One Really Cold Fucking Day. Of all the wind directions, northwest is one of my favorites, but not always. On shore, northwest blow is clear sunny skies by day, clear starry skies by night. One of my favorite rides home on the Calvin L. Stinson was a 3/4 side tube full moon with a 30 to 40 knot autumn wind. The boat rolled almost completely onto its starboard side, then straight up to the port side, back and forth. So we kind of do this. They wouldn't go all the way over, just this, and kept coming back up. But we're talking 20-foot troughs between the waves, but a beautiful starry night with a full moon. I sat quietly in the wheelhouse as Sandy Ritchie took us home from Jeffrey's ledge while Shannon, the skipper, slept in the bunk. We enjoyed the roll without comment, feeling the hum of the electromotive diesel, listening to the sounds of the decks awash, which each climbed back up to the port side. We enjoyed the way the moon lit up the dark seas, each top with a white cap gleaming in the moonlight on top of the black waves. Drop the temperature down 60 degrees when the wind chill comes starkly into play. It's another thing altogether. We got on board the Irene's Way in Gloucester one fine February morning after making the 3-hour drive south from Booth Bay. We tied up at Star Fisheries and took on fuel and ice, got our food delivery from the French Street Market, and made ready to sail. It was a cold, bright, sunny morning. We went out past the breakwater and headed east into the Gulf of Maine. The forecast was for light wind to start the trip, with northwest gale force winds predicted in a few days. The trip was uneventful at first. We steamed east for 10 hours and began the 3-hour cycle of setting out, towing, hauling back, setting out, dressing fish, getting a mug up, hauling back. We were fishing near Platt's Bank and Cassius and Phippany's ledges, hunting schools of fish. The bottom contour was hilly, so lots of hang-ups. We had a lot of mending between tows. As usual, Richard was motivated to get the net up and back as quickly as possible, which had him given to motivating us. Not that we needed it. We were a tight, seasoned crew at this point. Myself, Sandy Ritchie, Billy Rogers, Kelly Benner were fast at getting the gear back, fast getting it set out, and dressing and icing the fish, and all of us good with a twine needle. Spirits were high, the company was pleasant. Even so, Richard was animated and did a lot of cajoling. His marriage was not going well. He was fighting off creditors and a predatory bank that saddled him with a high-interest loan that was 10 months in arrears before he even took delivery of the boat. The bank didn't care if there was no money to be earned in the yard. It was a debt burden that he would never pay off. About halfway through the trip, the gale and the cold set in. It was 20 below with 40-knot winds. The wind chill was below -50. When very cold air passes over relatively warm water, and I say relatively, it gives rise to sea smoke. So it's nice and sunny on shore, but when you're offshore, you feel like you're in a fog bank. At low temp, it's a reverse kind of extra thick fog that comes up from the ocean and socks in hard and heavy. At low temperatures, the fog sticks to steel and quickly builds up ice on the superstructure, rails, wheelhouse, windows, deck, people, everything. When the wind is howling like that, it kicks up spray off the breaking whitecaps as usual, but at that temperature, it immediately freezes. The frozen spray feels like being sandblasted. It's amazing what rage and primal noises, animal growls one can make buffeted by that wind, fingers burning from the cold and hit in the face by a blast of ice crystals. Still, we faced it, our little gang drawing tighter together in the face of this frozen nightmare on the ice-covered deck. Richard kept fishing right through all of this. We'd run out on deck, bring the gear in on the reel, strap the bag, lift the caught in, pop the quick release, dump the fish. Then we'd hammer the release back in place, kick the bag out the stern, spool the net off, hooked the door chains to the ground cable, disengaged from the reel, and let Richard spool out the main wire. After dressing and packing the fish as quickly as we could, we stumbled back in the galley to warm up for an hour or two before doing it all over again. So fishing is like one long day that lasts a week. And there's no it's 10 o'clock, we're going to bed. It's the boat's working around the clock, you're working around the clock. So you might get a nap, here 3 or 4 half-hour to hour naps during a day, but you're pretty much awake the whole time. All the while, the wind howled and the ice-covered deck heaved and pitched. Any damage to the net was exponentially harder to fix. We'd immediately set the second net. We never called it a spare because we switched back and forth so often. Take care of the fish and get busy repairing the gear. Mending and even a simple tear was excruciating. You couldn't wear gloves and mend. It was so cold and unpleasant we took turns, 2 at a time, running back and forth from the galley. We could get in 4 or 5 meshes before we couldn't stand it, run back into the galley and warm up before switching out again. It took 4 of us an hour to mend, what one of us could do in 10 minutes. All the while, Richard was barking at us from the wheelhouse. He'd open the rear window, shout something, then close it again. The fucking glass oilskins makes the old man really tough, especially with other people's bodies. There's a line we all try to avoid seeing or even thinking about. It's the place we will all be at some point, faced starkly with our own mortality. I often wonder about those who served in combat, the connection to those alongside, the devotion to the moment, the task at hand, refusing to let the mind collapse in fear. Their service reminds me a simple frozen gale is really nothing compared to that. But we'll soon all be faced with our end, and all that matters is this moment, because life is a moment, not one in a series, but the vehicle we ride through time. And those alongside us, the personal connections we make, the opportunities to serve each other, to be a little kinder are what matters. In the 9-to-5 world, it's easy to forget this. It's easy to get wrapped up in the calendar, human events, politics, sports, a scheduled life. It's easy to become selfish and forget the line between life and death is always close. We'll eventually cross the line. If we're lucky, we get to understand what's important before we get there. So I left fishing and took a job with a customer of ours, and they hired me to be a fish buyer at the Portland Fish Auction as a 6-month gig as a consultant, and that turned into 35 years with this company called Foley Fish. They're a really prestigious company, and it was all about culture. So this section's called Today is Our Only Day in Business. My folks raised me on the principles of hard work, honesty, and elbow grease. Nothing pissed my folks off more than a half-assed job. This made me a perfect candidate to work at Foley Fish. Spending a few years on fishing boats, learning about and implementing quality at sea programs gave me a real push in the right direction to becoming a Foley guy. Foley's was the most prestigious fishmonger on the East Coast, perhaps the entire U.S. We didn't get that way by magically embossing the Foley name and logo on our fish tins. The well-earned reputation came from a group of hard-working men and women who disdained cutting corners, loved the effort required to do the things the Foley way, and passed that pride and passion for excellence along to generations of employees who work at Foley's simply by their example. So nobody called Foley's ever taught me how to be a Foley fish guy. It was really the people on either side of you working alongside you that said, we're going to do it this way. We're not going to cut corners. And it's in here 3 times, but the phrase is, when meat goes bad, it smells rancid. And when milk goes bad, it smells sour. And when fish goes bad, it smells fishy. Thank you. And it just illustrates how perishable the protein is. Fish is one of the hardest things to deal with because people think, well, it's fishy, I just don't like fish because it's fishy. And if the meat was rancid, you'd know not to eat it. Or if the milk was sour, you'd know not to drink it. But if the fish is fishy, people think that's fish. When we identify spoiled fish with how we think fish is supposed to smell. Intent creates example, example creates culture, culture creates success. Truth is, all my life I've been attracted to a certain kind of culture, the kind that holds hard work in high esteem and follows through at every turn, and I'm not perfect, doing things the right way. All too often, culture is misused to denigrate others, misused by people who don't get it. It's not about being arrogant or looking down on someone. It's about looking yourself in the mirror. I found that culture in kitchens beginning at age 14 and continuing through high school and college. I found it on the stern of the Lorna Lorry with Pop Durfee. I found it on trawlers fishing the Gulf of Maine and George's Bank. I fell in love with it at Foley's. Actually, probably should have switched this. Let's see. That's interesting. Sorry about this. I won't tell you about meeting Mike Foley. And let's see, I'll skip on to the next one. So Foley's was kind of a neat place to work. The guy at, I was taught by a number of guys, but one of them, Tommy Colbert, had been with the company for 52 years before he retired. And that was the Foley way. I was with him for 35. I was the new guy. The Foley way of doing things is to bring people in, to find the right kind of people, and then to ride them as long as they could put up with it. And actually, we loved it. I loved the fact that, you know, you start before most people are out of bed. I'd be on the Portland waterfront at like 5 in the morning, digging through totes of ice fish that were coming in from Canada, you know, fighting with the plant managers who were trying to keep me from looking at the fish, just because they didn't want their ice disturbed. And then going to the fish auction, which started at noon or 11 or 1, they kept changing the time, you know, and finishing my day there. And, you know, at the end of the day, after being in all that ice and in coolers, even in the summer, I'd make sure in the morning to park my car in a sunny spot, and leave the windows closed. And at the end of the day, I'd get in there and shut the windows. And if I was smart, I'd keep it so that the steering wheel was in the sun, and just hang on to the wheel and grip it and let the heat sink into my fingers, because we worked in coolers all day. But talk a little bit about auctions here. There's a chapter on Foley's, there's a chapter on fish auctions. It's called The Exchange. Buying fish at a seafood auction is a boisterous social event. The serious business of buying fish is pure capitalist competition, a place where bravado and ego meet street smarts, a touch of avarice, and the occasional bout of honorable behavior. It wasn't long before the other buyers took notice of the new guy, me again, and approached me with varying degrees of friendly outreach, mild intimidation, derision, and collusion. More than one buyer in those early days would sidle up to me and murmur about only needing a small amount of this or that species, and ask how much I was looking for, to try to forge a short-lived alliance. Short-lived because when someone bought more than expected, it was everyone for themselves. I wasn't sure how to respond at first. The communication included terms like working together, let's not beat each other up too much. I was agreeable to playing nice with others until Linda Foley explained the criminal penalties for price fixing. It was a great idea to avoid working together if it could lead to fines and jail time. It was better to remember the Irish wisdom about keeping one's own counsel. So I was on the board of directors of the Portland Fish Exchange for 10 years, and I spent 2 as chairman. And we had to discipline an employee. And it turned out, so there's the name of this is, I'll teach them effing bastards. There's a thing referred to as the slippery slope, something small that leads to bigger and even more dangerous consequences. One such example is when Dennis, a former GM at the Portland Fish Exchange, responded to a question from one of his unloading gangs with a casual comment, "Just make it disappear." National Marine Fisheries Service established a trip limit on codfish that began at 800 pounds a trip, was reduced to 600, then 300, then ultimately 30 pounds a trip, a laughably stupid attempt to reduce cod mortality. It did reduce reported landings, but not mortality. Cod, once brought aboard, would not survive. Throwing them back was plain stupid. Dennis was presented with a boat that was a few hundred pounds over the existing trip limit and told the gang to make it disappear. He didn't want to know how. This set in place a system where the overages kept disappearing, sometimes recorded as landings on another vessel, other times directly to local fish buyers. I stumbled onto this one morning when I noticed a small dragger with about 600 pounds of gillnet cod. Draggers don't catch gillnet cod, and you can tell a gillnet cod by the marks around the shoulder. It was listed for sale. I pulled aside Roger, the pier boss, I pulled Roger, the pier boss, aside and gathered his crew. I was on the PFB board of directors. I gave them a stern talk about how breaking the law never ended well, and when the guns and badges came out, your besties would roll over in a heartbeat to save their own skins. They all put on their best innocent looks, nodded and smiled approvingly, and thanked me for explaining this to them. I walked away smug in the knowledge that I had handled the situation and put an end to it. I got the part about being smug right and nothing else. In hindsight, I was a complete idiot. The cheating had been going on too long, and there was an infrastructure dependent upon it. Years later, the GM named Wendy called me in one morning, invited me as chair of the board to sit in on a disciplinary hearing for two key employees, Roger, the pier boss, and Lee, his right-hand man. I had heard rumors of fish disappearing off the display floor before the auction in single 100-pound totes in entire lots of 300 or 1,200 pounds. I just assumed they were honest mistakes. I remember one fisherman, Harry Ross, pulling me aside and warning me. I refused to believe there was anything sinister beyond bookkeeping errors. Harry passed away, by the way, during an ocean storm that sank his fishing boat. He stayed on the radio until the end. His last words that came over the radio were, "Oh God." The truth was, what began as a make 'em disappear turned into fish being offloaded and rolled directly onto waiting trucks owned by several of the local cutting houses. Business as usual. 100 pounds of monkfish at $3 a pound, or $3 to $6 a pound, routinely made the tally sheet, but not the floor. 300 pounds a lot, lots of small gray sole at $2.50 a pound began to disappear. Soon, entire 1,200-pound pallets came off the boat, bypassed the auction floor, and went directly onto trucks, all explained away by the pier boss as data entry errors. Sometimes it was a handful of PFE guys clipping the fish. Other times the boat crews were in on it too. Every time, 4 or 5 local fish companies participated. Instead of picking the fish up right after the noon auctions, they would come back early in the morning before they started their day to pick up their auction fish. They also got the illegally offloaded fish at the same time. The black market flourished, cash flowed. And there's illegal cash that's soon followed by drugs as part of the barter and trade. The slippery slope is greased by the darker side of human nature. Finally, a couple of our many honest employees complained. They held back for a while because Roger and Lee intimidated the crew. Lee was 6'2" and weighed 300 pounds. Roger was 6'1", 250. Both were physically strong and had friendly but aggressive natures. Roger had the keys to the building. I changed the names of these guys, by the way. But he was a trusted employee charged with opening the building at midnight to begin offloading boats. He ran the offloading crews and shipped fish from the previous day. So auction onto trucks from many local buyers who would pick up their purchases early the next morning. And by early, I mean like 3 in the morning. And before their cutting shops opened. This gave them the perfect cover to include some stolen fish along with their legal purchases. Finally, enough was enough. About 8 employees quietly asked for a meeting with Wendy and spilled the beans. Furthermore, Lee was often found sitting in the break room with the nods caused by his OxyContin habit, brought on in part by the illegal proceeds. We called Lee into the meeting and first called him out about missing fish and apparent drug use. Instead of denying anything, he simply said, "Why am I going down for this? Why isn't Roger going too?" Lee was suspended and we called Roger in. It was Roger's day off. He'd been hunting. He arrived still wearing camo and appeared to have been warned by Lee that we were on to him. He didn't deny anything either. He seemed shocked that we had forgotten all the times he had come in early to open the building and been there for the exchange whenever it needed him. He too was placed on unpaid administrative leave. Roger left the meeting. We stayed behind to wrap up a few loose ends. He went back out to his truck and in full view of 5 witnesses pulled out a .45 semi-automatic pistol, snapped a clip into a handle, jacked a shell in the chamber, and then said loudly, "I'll teach them fucking bastards." He began the walk back into the fish exchange. 4 of the 5 witnesses scattered. One didn't. I've seen bravery a few times in my life, my wife too. Yvette Alexander shaking as she walked up to testify at the New England Fisheries Management Council meeting in spite of a hate-filled mob from Portsmouth and Gloucester, or my brother fighting his way through the deck wash to get to me while I was being swept over the side. But the bravest was a 5-foot even, 95-pound soaking wet lad named Jonathan, a temp worker at the auction whose last name I'm embarrassed to have forgotten. Jonathan calmly stood in front of Roger. No, Rod, you ain't gonna hurt nobody today." "Get out of my way, Jonathan. I got no beef with you." "You ain't going in there." "Out of my way." The safety clicked off. "You have to come through me. Kill me first, Roger." Roger left, and we, blissfully ignorant of what almost happened, had our wrap-up meeting, interrupted by one of the panicked witnesses who came around through the back door to let us know. My first cowardly instinct was to head for the back door, but I stayed and we called the police. We were there giving our statements when Roger came back with more guns. What ensued was a Keystone Cop moment as Portland's finest, thank God for them, sirens blaring, chased Roger's truck down Commercial Street and arrested him. Chief Michael Chitwood checked back with us and informed us Roger had 20 guns in his apartment, and no matter the outcome of the supposed trial, they would never be returned, having been lost or accidentally destroyed. The police were never interested in the black market, illegally landed fish, cash, drugs, or the graft and corruption of some of the local fish dealers, just the criminal threatening. Roger got 4 years, all but 6 months suspended, and I never walked out of a building on the waterfront for years without taking a good look around to see if anybody would be waiting there. We got a couple more here. Holy cow. So I served on the Groundfish Advisory Panel for 20 years and the Highly Migratory Species Advisory Panel for 17. And the name of this chapter is Nymphomaniacs. Sorry, that was unfortunate, but keeping our pants up. In late 1996, Mike Foley called me up with his usual direct style. Gerencer, I'm tired of getting caught with our pants down. Sorry, our what? Raising his voice, he said, Nymphs keep screwing us. Wait, who? Nymphs, National Marine Fisheries Service. I could hear the exasperation in Mike's voice. Not a good idea to get Big Bird upset. Somebody has to keep track of things so we can stay ahead of the regulations. Someone? You. If it would, where to start? I tried calling several folks with likely sounding titles in the NIMS directory who all seemed to be away from their desks. I didn't bother leaving messages. Undeterred, I kept trying and eventually got an actual human who directed me to the next New England Fishery Management Council meeting. They manage fisheries, the NIMS manages fisheries at the local level through a system of regional councils. There's 8 regions, and New England's one of them. On the scheduled date, I showed up at a large meeting room in the Boston area. There were token visits to Maine and Connecticut, but they most always met in the quote Boston area. So New Hampshire coastline, all 15 miles of it counts as Boston area. I was greeted outside the room by a table full of meeting documents and a sign-in list. I signed in, helped myself to several useful-looking printed offerings, and went in. And it describes the table and everything and how the room filled up. I took a seat out back and listened as the chair called the meeting to order, and I was quickly lost. Acronyms were tossed around like beanbags at a cornhole festival. Terms I had no idea of got bandied about by those in the know, and the whole process was ruled by mathematicians, statisticians to be more precise. These are some of the smartest folks I've ever met, the smartest folks anyone has ever met, and they knew it. My degree in biochemistry with a heavy dose of mathematics was a little help. I began wishing I had taken more stats classes. So I solved that problem by going to Woods Hole and meeting with the chief of the population dynamics branch once a year, and actually went through a couple generations of those guys. And so that's fisheries management. It's laptops and meetings, and it's frustrating, and it's energy sucking, and it's you feel like you're never going to get anything done. But the truth is, it's democracy. It's how democracy works. It's the marketplace of ideas, and often those ideas get befuddled with lots of other stuff. But eventually, we actually did some good things. There's still a lot of problems, which I called out and continue to call out. One of them is the fact that we deal with high levels of uncertainty. And I read this, I'm not going to read it through it all, but I talk about it in here. But the bottom line is, if you turned on the TV and somebody said, candidate X leads candidate Y in the upcoming election, 44 to 40%, plus or minus 40, you shut the TV off. That's statistically useless. But we routinely get management advice, or actually stock assessment advice, that's 40% uncertain. It's useless, but because of the way the law is written, you have to use it. So we're stuck in this sort of regulatory trap, or even though we cut the number of groundfish boats from 2,500 back in when I was taking out fish down the street here to less than 200 boats. And there's actually a lot of fish in the ocean, you just can't catch them. And the species mix is changing. big time. Anybody who's on the water knows this. Nobody's really catching lobsters in Casco Bay anymore, and they keep moving east. You know, an oyster that's 3 inches used to take 3 years in Casco Bay, now takes 18 months. So maybe that's a good thing, but maybe not. But there is a way out. I'm not going to read too many more of these because I didn't realize how fast time was flying here. A few thoughts of what it's like to work on an offshore boat. The 9-to-5 world doesn't exist out here, neither do days and nights. Your day begins when you untie the lines, leave the wharf, and it ends when you get back to the dock. A trip boat could stay out for a week or more. A trip lasts from the time you leave to the time you return. The sun may rise and set multiple times, but it all blends into one long day. To live in this environment, feeling the salt air in your face as the moisture content, temperature, and wind velocity go through constant change is exhilarating, if you let it be. It's easy and even necessary to be fully present and joyful because you are. Some became overwhelmed and I didn't blame them. Well, maybe a little. But holding up to the onslaught of wind weather with little or to no sleep is a young person's game, and it makes you old fast if you aren't careful. The mind gets used to springing into action at a moment's notice with no room for idle thoughts. Focus on what's right in front of you. I've heard the scream of more than one shipmate who let his mind drift and got a foot crushed by roller gear or tendons in the arm sliced by his own ripper. The cost of not being present is real. We had compassion for these guys, but not sympathy, because their mistakes put the whole crew at risk, or at least we all had to make up for their share of the work we were no longer able to do. I smile at some of the NGO kids dreaming of the natural world from their well-funded air-conditioned office spaces, going on the occasional hike in the wilderness or a trip on a survey vessel, getting paid to show up at fishery management meetings, scoffing at a fisherman who had to take time off from work to attend and who may not have the best command of the English language, calling them ignorant, stupid, and resource rapers. These folks have any real connection to the natural world? Do they know what it's like to have to trust the boat and a handful of others for your livelihood and your life? Probably not. At least they care about the environment. Their mistake is lining up against fishermen. Niaz Dory from Greenpeace knew this. She said, beneath the surface of every fisherman is an environmentalist. So I think I'll end it there. Does anybody have any questions?
I know I do, but I'm just not sure what they are yet. Yeah.
Okay, well.
So I'm from the Chesapeake Bay originally, and we lost our working waterfront pretty hard. It's coming back a little bit. But can you talk a little bit about how Maine and the New England area is kind of holding out against the, part of it is like species mixture, like you're saying, and loss of populations, but also like fighting the push of like the corporatization of the waterfront itself, and like how you keep working waterfront spaces for watermen in this time when people want to make condos out of pretty much every inch of waterfront?
That's a great question. One of the early lessons I learned from savvy fishermen is fish got tails. And it meant a lot of things. It meant that they may not be the same place you look for them, but it also meant that, and they would say this, you know, just because you're chasing haddock today doesn't mean you can chase haddock next year. They might not be around altogether. And back in those days, if there was no haddock to catch, you know, or cod to catch, the small boats would be able to do some lobstering and some shrimping and do other things, because things change, and they're changing even faster because of the climate change. And anybody who works on the water understands this is a thing. I think if you live in a world where you wake up in an air-conditioned house, drive your air-conditioned car to your air-conditioned office, then go back home and plop yourself in front of your flat screen and it fills your head with stuff, it's easy to believe that somehow this is a hoax. But if you work there every day, you know it isn't. But I think what I'm getting to is, to survive as a part of the working waterfront, you have to be flexible. If I was a 30-year-old or 24-year-old sternman on a lobster boat, I'd be looking to get an aquaculture lease going too, and getting into the shellfish biz. And unfortunately, right now there's a little bit of I wouldn't call it animosity, but there's sort of a struggle between wild harvest fishermen like lobstermen and aquaculture people, and there's legitimate concerns, especially for the lobster industry. But that's being complicated by a group of people who don't care about either one. They don't want to look out their front window and see a aquaculture farm, and so they actually started these astroturf groups and called them like Save Maine's Fishing Heritage, and pit lobstermen against aquaculture people when really they don't want to see any of it, and they want to look out there. They're here for like 5.9 months a year, but they have the money and the wherewithal. You know, the Friends of Blue Hill Bay did it. There's a group out of Portland that are doing it, and the key is, you know, aquaculture's big, but you could take every single aquaculture lease and the square footage would fit easily inside of the Rockland breakwater. And that doesn't mean that we can have a lot more aquaculture, because things like oysters can only grow in certain places. But the point is, in order to survive, the industry has to be flexible. It's tougher now because a lot of the guys, like the lobstermen, used to do part-time ground fishing in the winter, but the fish disappeared. So they put the gear in the bank and stopped buying their permits. And then when the regulations came down, they said, well, if you don't have a permit, you can no longer get one. You can't just go apply for one and pay the fee and wait for it to show up. If you didn't have one, you couldn't get one. The only way to get one was to buy one from somebody who had one. It became a closed fishery. So NIMS started putting everybody in boxes. And at some point, we'll have to revisit that, because that doesn't have to be a long-term thing. But because it's democracy, it's going to take time. But I don't trust, you know, putting one guy in charge of everything, because all his friends will do well, and who knows what everybody else gets. So I kind of rambled, but hopefully that gave you some insight. It's going to take resilience, but anybody who's got a life on the water is used to that, is used to, you know, being faced with problems every day and solving them.
So how do we know, I mean, I get monkfish at Jess's, how do I know that that's been, I mean, I just assume that it's legally caught in there. But when you talked about, you know, fish disappearing, how do we know that we're actually supporting the fishermen?
Well, because you're buying it from Jess's first place.
Yeah.
He's a, you know, reputable fish dealers. There have been some scoundrels. I actually knew somebody called Carlos Rafael, whose nickname was the Codfather, out of New Bedford. And he had a real scam going. And he's out of the business and he's in jail. And the companies that were, you know, that whole thing, we did stop it. Once we caught it, we stopped it. The fishermen that are left are here because they love fishing, and they understand that their job isn't to catch the last fish in the ocean, it's to sustainably harvest for the next generation. So I think that, you know, by and large, the regulations are so tough and so tight, it isn't the fish that are endangered anymore, it's the industry that's having a hard time surviving. So by supporting local fishermen, by, you know, buying monkfish at Jess's, you know, that's how you help the industry thrive and stay in business. So I'm not, you know, I saw a lot of scoundrel stuff going on, but I also saw, I guess the scoundrel stuff sells better, but in here it also talks about honorable people and people who care. You know, we were so committed to quality and doing things the right way, it wasn't funny, and I wouldn't talk to other people in the auction, and most people wouldn't, but there were always a couple of guys, but those guys, they're in it for the easy buck. When the buck gets hard, they go away. They'll go find their easy money somewhere else, and there's no easy money in the fish business right now. That's a great question.
The next one really then is, how are the local fishermen affected by international waters and, you know, huge boat fishing from?
That's no longer a thing. We have something called an exclusive economic zone in this country, the EEZ, also sort of referred to colloquially as the 200-mile limit. And it's not exactly 200 miles because we share a border with Canadian waters. So when I started fishing, we used to fish in a place called the Trees, which is off the northeast peak of Georges down in the deep water. We can't fish on the northeast peak or in the Trees anymore because that's now Canadian water. They cut the baby in half and gave the peak and that part to Canada, but Canada could no longer come and fish there. And prior to that, we had a 3-mile limit. And so there were fleets of distant water boats from the Eastern Bloc countries, from Russia, from, there would be like a mothership about 600 feet long and a fleet of 300-foot trawlers. Our biggest boats were 130, and those boats don't exist on this coast anymore. Our biggest boats now, our average size fishing boat is like 50 feet. And there's a few bigger boats, you see them in Portland and New Bedford, but there was about 200 active boats, and the average size is much smaller. Back then, the average size was probably 90, and boats would disappear because they'd hook up with one of these Eastern Bloc boats with a gear, and they'd just get towed under. And those guys wouldn't do anything. And they would fish within 3 miles, and these guys would come and bracket the fishing ground. They'd line up 6 boats in a row and just take everything. And they never fed a seagull because even the guts went into like a fish meal plant on these big factory ships, and they just passed the ball back. And these poor guys were working for like $1 a day. I have a friend, Zane Gargola, who jumped ship from a Polish trawler and swam. He was off Jersey in the winter, and he swam like 2 miles to shore, towing his friend who passed out from the cold. But Zane was superhuman, and he became a really good fisherman. He had some alcohol problems which cost him his boat, and he was fishing a much smaller boat, but he was an amazing human being. But that's so they put in and those fleets always had one boat that was like bristling with antennas 3 miles offshore, so they were fishing for something else. But that went away in the late 70s. And so what happened was, the fish stocks, which were crashing because all these Eastern Bloc countries fishing the heck out of Georgia's, which, by the way, when you think about the ocean, you think of, oh, it's just this wonderful fish park. It isn't. It's a giant, empty, aqueous desert with a few hot spots, and the Georges Bank, Gulf of Maine is one of the few, and it's an amazing place. It's been fished at, boats, some of the earliest people to come to this side of the world came here for fish, and then they'd sail back with them. People are like, where'd you catch those? So it needs to be well taken care of. So what happened was the government said, well, we no longer have these guys, and the stocks started going back up, so they made fishing boats tax shelters, and every doctor and lawyer got 6 of them. So we overcapitalized, and so now we're into the early 90s, and we're realizing that you can't do this, and fish stocks are crashing again, and so we started putting in restrictions. And in the chapter Nymphomaniacs, it talks about how we had looked at all these different ways to manage fish stocks, and in the end, we just threw up our hands and chose them all. Closed areas, mesh sizes, trip limits, catch limits, gear restrictions, and a couple others. And then we went to something called catch shares, which is a sort of a twisted way to put in quotas. And they were supposed to replace everything else. Now we have quotas, we still have everything else. We still have, the closed areas were supposed to be, year-round closures, now they're permanent closures. And you can't get it back open again, because then you're fighting all these groups that are, one of the dirty little secrets of fisheries management is most of the NGOs are funded by oil companies. And so like EDF, all these companies get funding from oil companies. I was on the Highly Migratory Species Advisory Panel in 2010 when Deepwater Horizon happened. And there's 40 people on there from Maine to Texas, and we're primarily charged with sword tuna, billfish, and sharks. And the Deepwater Horizon is in DeSoto Canyon, which is the prime bluefin spawning ground in the Western Hemisphere. And we were raising hell because they're dumping all these dispersants in to make the oil sink so you can't see it, into a prime spawning ground. And so everybody was talking about it, all 40. I'd never seen everybody speak with one voice. And then Pew got up and we're like, okay, we're all gonna be together. And he read a 4-page paper on why we should end longlining in the Gulf of Mexico, because you can't speak out against the major funders. So, and it's kind of a win for the oil companies because they get to blame it on the liberals. And they also get to take these kids who I love and are passionate about saving the world and say, yeah, leave the drilling platforms alone. Go after those fishermen, because they don't have the money or the wherewithal, and we'll just, you can only do so much with your life. So they were keeping these kids all busy doing that. So we'd get, these people would show up at the fishery management meetings, get themselves appointed to the council and show up with a staff of 12. Meanwhile, the poor fisherman who took the trip off so he could attend the meeting and it's not getting paid for it is, trying to compete with that. So the bottom line is, I'm not worried about the fish stocks, other than the fact that they're changing due to climate change. But we've got stuff moving up here, black sea bass, a few blue crabs, plenty of green crabs. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I know that fish got tails and you have to be resilient. Yes, ma'am.
Contentious question, but we love to talk about offshore wind as like a really great power source, but from a fishing standpoint and an ocean destruction standpoint, how does all of the chaos that creation of an offshore wind farm cause to the seabed affect fisheries, and how does the fisheries management, like, do you guys have any voice in talking about those locations when it comes to planning?
Sadly, I'm probably not qualified to say much about it because I haven't been too involved in it. I left the advisory panels a few years ago. I kind of follow it a little bit, and what I found was that their voices were basically drowned out. I saw a lot of well-reasoned arguments that weren't listened to. I think that renewable energy is really important to the world, and there has to be a balance of, we're going to just, I get the sense that the offshore wind can disrupt a lot of fishing and make things bad, but I don't feel real qualified to speak about it. It's because I might just be making stuff up, and my father taught me, don't say anything if you don't know what you're talking about, so. Thank you, it was a good question though. It encouraged me to go learn more. That was my thing. I always loved the question. I did a lot of staff training, and I love a question I can't answer because that means I get to learn something too. It might not be tonight, but it'll be soon. So I encourage you to try the same. Thank you. And thanks everybody for coming. It means a lot. That's all I got.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill.